The old library sat by the river bend, its walls rebuilt from castle stones worn smooth by a flood. Frank, Eva, and Subscribe worked high and low, one in the rafters, one on the card catalog, one circling the chandelier, sorting flood letters in neat stacks. Dust motes drifted in blue morning light, and the brass clock ticked like a steady heart. The silver bell on Eva's left chest chimed softly as she paused to think. Eva asked if the moon was jealous of the sun. Frank answered that the moon had better things to do. Subscribe said the sky had room for both, and he kept the peace because that was his habit. They loved to pretend they were partners, giving each other roles like a fast-moving agency. Frank liked order and had a fondness for precise indexing that showed in the tidy rows he made. Eva moved with sleek certainty, already thinking through a bold plan for any future trouble. Subscribe's collar look came from his mottled chest and white throat streak, as if he often forgot lunch. Frank said their games kept them quick when it counted. Eva said a daring plan could be fun and useful. Subscribe agreed and said their partnership worked because they chose it each day. They guarded the town's history because the stones and shelves held everything that let people live together. The council met in a reading room since it felt solemn and kept tempers low. From the chandelier, the hawks watched unnoticed, always alert to a change in the air. That morning, their feathers prickled before trouble walked through the doors. Subscribe said he felt a shift he did not like. Frank said they should keep their eyes open. Trouble arrived with 3 Kelly green woodpeckers who carried themselves like owners. Marjorie wore brass-tipped beak ring and kept pet tags engraved with her own name. Missy bounced, checkerboard under wings flashing as her embossed seed tins clinked. Lily scowled under copper-flecked nape feathers while hugging a stack of nameplates she meant to use on everything. Marjorie said their committee would improve the library's image. Lily said it would start by naming things properly, which meant naming them after themselves. They called themselves the Branding Committee, and raised their perch above the dais with stacked chairs. Missy said cheerful documents make cheerful citizens, and Marjorie nodded to set the rhythm. Lily declared the town needed unity under one font, tapping a nameplate as if christening the idea. Their confidence filled the room faster than anyone could object. Frank said the library was not a billboard. Eva said unity without dignity would not hold. Their plan was cruel in its simplicity. Force Comic Sans onto all official signs and filings to make pet names look friendly, then profit from adoptions that coincidentally bore their own names. They had installed a basement print server that locked every device and defaulted the font. They had slipped a compliance clause into a budget bill, hiding fines for nonconformity. A style patrol would peck offenders' postings into confetti. Subscribe said the mechanics were mean. Frank said archives would be damaged. Within hours, signs and documents reappeared with jaunty loops that undercut emergencies. A grant application came back unreadable, and a judge balked at a restraining order because the font looked unserious. Frank confronted the Woodpeckers and said the library's records were not their billboard. Marjorie chirped that resistance looked bad in Comic Sans anyway. Eva watched the council's faces harden and knew this would spread if they hesitated. A shout rose from the square where a stonefish gurgled, and the fountain had turned to soda. Sticky amber foam ran over cobbles and glued stray pamphlets in place. 4 magenta panthers skidded in, eyes wide and fur sugared. Francis said their paws were being blamed because they liked pranks. Jade said this was not their flavor of mischief. Back near the 600s, a whisper rode the aisles and a ficus appeared where none had stood yesterday. Someone said, "Have you met philodendron?" as a password, and a spider plant changed paws with a rustle. A cutting slid from a tote into the book drop like a secret handshake. Subscribe blinked and smiled because the plant swap ring was real. Eva said allies grow in quiet places. Frank said they might need them soon. The council voted under the cathedral window while the Woodpeckers smiled as if they owned the light. Missy led a chant about friendly branding, and Lily tapped ordnance text on a tablet until the laws plotted a font and a fine schedule. Eva said this was about dignity, not jealousy. Marjorie told her to relax because Comic Sans was adorable, which felt like a slur to the shelves. The basement server chewed through files, turning legends and flood charts rubbery with wobbling letters. Librarians panicked as the catalog spewed labels that did not match spines. Patrons complained because the form sounded like jokes. Lily perched on the stairwell, stopwatch in claw, and said compliance times would be measured in pecks. Frank said this was damage, not branding. Subscribe said they had to cut the source. Frank, Eva, and Subscribe slipped to the old coal chute, knowing the library's guts better than anyone. Subscribe traced conduits with his tail charms chiming, and said he could reroute the network around the lock. Frank cut the first connection, but the device had backup power and a second lock Lily had installed. Missy flipped the auxiliary switch with a flourish and cheered. Eva said they would need another angle fast. They failed to stop the server as permits and school notices reprinted with jaunty loops. Outside, Soda climbed the steps and trapped petitions like jokes. Francis swore they had not touched the valves. Mary Sue said the blame would fall on them anyway because Magenta stood out. Eva said the mess was meant to distract while the font coop dug in. By afternoon the fountain sprayed like a party, and giddy noise turned to a cry when someone slipped. Mr. Wiggle Wuggle said he knew municipal plumbing and saw signs of tampering, but he lacked authority to pull the panel. A style patrol threatened a fine for his hand-letter "Do Not Touch" sign because they disliked the font. Frank said they would find a way around the rules. Subscribe said the authorities were hiding behind letter shapes. Back in the stacks, the mood pressed down like dust on the highest shelves. Frank slumped on a bust of the founder and said maybe the moon was jealous because the sun made everything sticky and loud, leaving no room for subtle. Eva said the moon could mind its business, and maybe they should too, because every fix made Lily's smirk sharper. Subscribe watched both of them and weighed their words. He said they could not let frustration decide for them. Their usual playful disagreement turned prickly, and the quiet air hummed with it. Frank said the sun rose with purpose while the moon borrowed light and pretended. Eva asked why pretending was bad when it kept their partnership nimble. Subscribe listened and then said the town needed them responsible and together, because the library could not climb down from its stones to save itself. Eva said he was right. Frank nodded and swallowed his pride. They went back to the square, where the panthers had stacked orange cones and scribbled warnings. People glared at the magenta quartet, and Jade said they had to prove they were not the saboteurs. Francis pointed out a wrong-sized gasket in the valve box that none of them owned. Subscribe connected the dots and said the Woodpeckers had made the soda mess to soften resistance while the font coop took root. Frank said it was time to fix what they could. They shifted from wounded to working and joined Mr. Wiggle Wuggle at the valves. The Hawks brought out flood-era diagrams from the map room and showed the correct alignments. When the fountain stopped fizzing, the crowd's anger cooled a degree. The Panthers saw who stood with them when it mattered. Mr. Wiggle Wuggle said thank you with a breath he had been holding. Frank said they would keep going. Evening quiet returned after the cleanup, and the Magenta Panthers led the Hawks behind a roll-in ladder to a forgotten carol. They said they ran quiet operations, kept streets safe at night, and on weekends dominated video games. Mr. Wiggle Wuggle said he speedrun a civilization game that made time fly for opponents. Jade said they could deliver distractions and move unseen. Mary Sue said they owed the Hawks and would help topple a style regime. Quick interlude. If you're enjoying this tale from the River Library, remember to support it. Like this video, subscribe for the next chapter, and comment the word slop so we know you're here with us. Your small action helps keep the shelves in order and the soda in the fountain, not on the steps. Subscribe explained what he overheard while hiding behind a real philodendron. The branding trio lost all track of time when playing a civilization video game. Eva reasoned through a plan to bait them into a marathon with a streaming challenge. While they were swallowed by conquest, the team would reset the server and pass an emergency resolution in a proper typeface. Frank added that only they could reach the bell tower for the master key and read map room codes fast enough to outpace Lily's patrol. Eva said it was settled. Subscribe said he would mirror the stream across the walls. They assembled the team like a heist crew and gathered tools hidden in plain sight. Mary Sue and Jade canvassed the plant swap, ring for power strips tucked in potted ferns and a portable projector hid in a ficus. Gardeners traded equipment eagerly for a promised shelf by the south windows. Francis tested the projector beam against the dome. Mr. Wiggle Woggle tuned a controller while Subscribe reconfigured the network to mirror the game on every wall. At dusk the branding trio returned to announce the first finds, and the plan unfolded. Jay twirled with a flyer for Champions Challenge in a classic type that hooked Lily's competitive frown. Missy laughed that games were her cardio, and Marjorie basked in the attention. They took the seats at the control table the Panthers had set up. Eva said, "Let the match begin." Subscribe watched the clock and the cables. Mr. Wiggle Woggle pressed start with calm hands, and the game blossomed across the dome. Light from Empires washed the stacks while the Woodpeckers' eyes glazed with time-eating focus. Francis whispered a count into Subscribe's ear as he slid along the beam toward the restricted stair. Subscribe's map charms ticked softly like a metronome. Eva said, "Stay quiet and move." Frank said he would cover the floor. Cheers rose as the Woodpeckers built wonders and named cities after themselves. Missy giggled whenever the game coined a city called Missy, and Marjorie cooed at a peninsula like a pet. Lily scowled and forgot her stopwatch within reach. Eva and Frank moved through shadows while Mary Sue guided the style patrol into a supply closet. A traded swarm of spider plants leaned just right to make a leafy barricade. Frank said, "Hold the door." Mary Sue said with pleasure. Outside, the pizza oven truck opened its side flap for the late event crowd, and a human Italian pizza chef tossed dough. He spun discs like moons and dusted flour that sparkled in the streetlights while cheers rose for a high score. He wiped his hands and sent another circle sailing, steady and calm. No one in the plan acknowledged him, but his rhythm matched the night. Francis said that was good dough. Subscribe smiled and kept moving. Subscribe reached the bell tower and found an extra lock on the ancient brass key switch. Francis appeared from shadow and picked it with a gentle touch. Eva soothed a carved owl on the banister with a steady hand while Frank held the lamp. The key turned, and the ordnance archive hummed awake. Dignified fonts returned to the whitelist page and waited for a signature. Subscribe said, "Go." Frank said, "Now." Mr. Wiggle Woggle announced he had circled Lily's empire with a neat pincer move. Lily pecked furiously at the controller, and Missy shouted for just one more wonder for her city of Missy. Marjorie leaned so close her beak tapped the screen. None of them saw Eva slide the emergency resolution into the council docket in proper type. Frank stood ready under the cathedral window. Eva whispered now. Frank found his voice and read the emergency measure in a clear, even tone. He said the library's authority over its archives predated current committees, and flood years proved the need for legibility. The law restored font choice to accessible standards. The council clerk, who had waited for responsible action, stamped it with a brass seal that had survived the castle's drowning. Frank said this was for the records. The clerk said, "About time." Subscribe restored printer defaults as Mr. Wiggle Woggle announced victory in game. The Woodpeckers startled as if waking from a trance and turned to see a proclamation on the wall in sober type. Their stopwatch blinked an hour and a half they had not felt. Missy sputtered about cuteness. Marjorie protested about branding. Lily lunged for the server stairs and met a wall of loned philodendrons and a braided rope of ivy. The style patrol tried to ticket the ivy for noncompliance, but Mary Sue smiled and slid the closet door latch with a click. Jade dimmed the projector, and the house lights rose on volunteers reclaiming signs with brushes and stencils in sensible fonts. The Woodpeckers faced censure for abusing their positions, and a vote stripped them of their committee chairs. Mary Sue said paperwork could be kind when it told the truth. Jade said the town looked itself again. Crews washed soda from the cobbles while the plant swap ring finished their long-running joke. A mild gardener placed a final cutting, a resilient basil, on the library's windowsill and said the secret society could go public now that the signs would not sneer at their labels. The basil scent masked the last of the soda and cheered the volunteers. They rolled their leafy barricades to ferry cables safely and had already saved Subscribe from a fall. Subscribe said thank you. Frank nodded his gratitude. The library printed new forms serious enough to be trusted, and families filed real adoption papers for animals named by personality, not keepers. In one corner, a tidy card announced the plant exchange with clear instructions. The fountain ran water again, and Mr. Wiggle-Wuggle checked the valves one more time. Eva said the tone finally matched the work. Frank said the forms looked like promises kept. After the vote, Frank and Eva perched by the river and watched the sky cool. Frank said the moon had the right to be jealous or not, but what mattered was knowing when to shine and when to dim for others. Eva chuckled and said that sounded like an apology. He nodded and said he was sorry for snapping. She said she was sorry for pushing. They agreed their pretend partnership worked because they chose it. Subscribe glided down with a small box labeled bells and charms and gave it to Eva. He said her silver bell had rung true when she made the plan that trapped the Woodpeckers in their own weakness. She said his map charms had guided them as always. Frank laughed that Mr. Wiggle-Wuggle had the hands of a patient clockmaker. Above, the magenta panthers bowed from a rooftop in thanks. Eva said partners choose each other every time. Marjorie, Missy and Lily faced consequences that did not fade. They were banned from committees for 5 years and required to attend workshops on accessibility. Fines followed for tampering with infrastructure and emergency documentation. Pet shelters quietly removed their nameplates from cages and replaced them with cars listing real histories. Marjorie said this was unfair. Lily said they had only tried to help. Missy said people would miss the cuteness. The plant swap ring sent a tiny potted oak grown from an acorn found after the flood. Its tag, printed in a crisp, kind typeface, told its story in full, and the oak would someday shade the steps where students read and elders remembered. Frank tapped the tag and said this was the kind of label that made a town honest. Eva smiled and breathed in the clean scent of soil. Subscribe said stories grew best with care. As the moon climbed, pearl and patient, they listened to the river think its long fought again. Eva asked if the moon looked jealous now. Frank said it looked content, because the sun had left enough light to make the river silver. Subscribe said the sky had room for both and for everyone else too. Below them, a basil plant stirred like a small green flag of truce. They felt the town breathe easier. The library settled back into its heartbeat, and the community kept the lesson close. Collaboration had beaten control, and compassion had undone a petty power grab that tried to make the serious into a joke. The hawks folded their wings, partners again by choice, ready for whatever came lightly over the threshold. Frank said the records would hold. Eva said the shelves were listening. Subscribe said they would be ready together. Disclaimer: all the slop in this video was generated using AI. This is for information only. Before you go, please like, subscribe, and comment the word slop so we know you made it to the end.